Notes on a Native Son. After reading a couple of James Baldwin's books, I began experiencing that continuous delight one feels upon discovering a fascinating, brilliant talent on the scene. A talent capable of penetrating so profoundly into one's own little world that one knows oneself to have been unalterably challenged and liberated. Liberated from the frustrating grasp of whatever devils happen to possess one. Being a Negro, I have found this to be a rare and infrequent experience, for few of my black brothers and sisters here in America have achieved the power which James Baldwin calls his revenge, which outlasts kingdoms, the power of doing whatever cats like Baldwin do when combining the alphabet with the volatile elements of his soul. And, like it or not, a black man, unless he has become irretrievably white-minded, responds with an additional dimension of his being to the articulated experience of another black, in spite of the universality of human experience. I, as I imagine many others did and still do, lusted for anything that Baldwin had written. It would have been a gas for me to sit on a pillow beneath the womb of Baldwin's typewriter and catch each newborn page as it entered this world of ours. I was delighted that Baldwin, with those great big eyes of his, which one thought to be fixedly focused on the macrocosm, could also pierce the microcosm. And although he was so full of sound, he was not a noisy writer like Ralph Ellison. He placed so much of my own experience, which I thought I had understood, into new perspective. Gradually, however, I began to feel uncomfortable about something in Baldwin. I was disturbed upon becoming aware of an aversion in my heart to part of the song he sang. Why this was so, I was unable at first to say. Then I read Another Country, and I knew why my love for Baldwin's vision had become ambivalent. Long before I had become a student of Norman Mailier's The White Negro, which seemed to me to be prophetic and penetrating in its understanding of the psychology involved in the accelerating confrontation of black and white in America. I was therefore personally insulted by Baldwin's flippant, schoolmarmish dismissal of the white Negro. Baldwin committed a literary crime by his arrogant repudiation of one of the few gravely important expressions of our time. The white Negro may contain an excess of esoteric verbal husk, but one can forgive Miller for that because of the solid kernel of truth he gave us. After all, it is the baby we want, and not the blood of afterbirth. Miller described, in that incisive essay, the first important chinks in the mountain of white supremacy. Important because it shows the depth of ferment on a personal level in the white world. People are feverishly and at great psychic and social expense seeking fundamental and irrevocable liberation, and, what is more important, are succeeding in escaping from the big white lies that compose the monolithic myth of white supremacy, black inferiority, in a desperate attempt on the part of a new generation of white Americans to enter into the cosmopolitan, egalitarian spirit of the 20th century. But let us examine the reasoning that lies behind Baldwin's attack on Mailer. There is in James Baldwin's work the most grueling, agonizing, total hatred of the blacks, particularly of himself, and the most shameful, fanatical, fawning, sycophantic love of the whites that one can find in the writings of any black American writer of note in our time. This is an appalling contradiction, and the implications of it are vast. A rereading of Nobody Knows My Name cannot help but convince the most avid of Baldwin admirers of the hatred for blacks permeating his writings. In the essay Princes and Powers, Baldwin's antipathy toward the black race is shockingly clear. The essay is Baldwin's interpretation of the Conference of Black Writers and Artists which met in Paris in September 1956. The portrait of Baldwin that comes through his words is that of a mind in unrelenting opposition to the efforts of solemn, dedicated black men who have undertaken the enormous task of rejuvenating and reclaiming the shattered psyches and culture of the black people, a people scattered over the continents of the world and the islands of the seas, where they exist in the mud of the floor of the foul dungeon into which the world has been transformed by whites. In his report of the conference, Baldwin, the reluctant black, dragging his feet at every step, could only ridicule the vision and efforts of these great men and heap scorn upon them, reserving his compliments, all of them left-handed, for the speakers at the conference who were themselves rejected and booed by the other conferees because of their reactionary, sycophantic views. Baldwin felt called upon to pop his cap pistol in a duel with Aimé Césaire, the big gun from Martinique. Indirectly, Baldwin was defending his first love, the white man. But the revulsion which Baldwin felt for the blacks at this conference, who were glorifying in their blackness, seeking and showing their pride in negritude and the African personality, drives him to self-revealing sortie after sortie, so obvious in Princes and Powers. Each successive sortie, however, becomes more expensive than the last one, because to score each time he has to go a little farther out on the limb, and it takes him a little longer each time to hustle back to the cover and camouflage of the perfumed smokescreen of his prose. Now and then we catch a glimpse of his little jive ass, his big eyes peering back over his shoulder in the mischievous retreat of a child sneak thief from a cookie jar. In the autobiographical notes of Notes of a Native Son, Baldwin is frank to confess that in growing into his version of manhood in Harlem, he discovered that since his African heritage had been wiped out and was not accessible to him, he would appropriate the white man's heritage and make it his own. This terrible reality, central to the psychic stance of all American Negroes, revealed to Baldwin that he hated and feared white people. Then he says, quote, "This did not mean that I loved black people. On the contrary, I despised them, possibly because they failed to produce Rembrandt." End quote. The psychic distance between love and hate could be the mechanical difference between a smile and a sneer, or it could be the journey of a nervous impulse from the depths of one's brain to the tip of one's toe. But this impulse in its path through North American nerves may, if it is honest, find the passage disputed, may find the leap from the fiber of hate to that of love too taxing on its meager store of energy, and so the long trip back may never be completed, may end in a reconnaissance, a compromise, and then a lie. Self-hatred takes many forms. Sometimes it can be detected by no one, not by the keenest observer. not by the self-hater himself, not by his most intimate friends. Ethnic self-hate is even more difficult to detect, but in American Negroes, this ethnic self-hatred often takes the bizarre form of a racial death wish, with many and elusive manifestations. Ironically, it provides much of the impetus behind the motivations of integration, and the attempt to suppress or deny such drives in one's psyche leads many American Negroes to become ostentatious separationalists, black Muslims, and back to Africa advocates. It is no wonder that Elijah Muhammad could conceive of the process of controlling evolution whereby the white race was brought into being. According to Elijah, about 6,300 years ago, all the people of the earth were original blacks, secluded on the island of Patmos. A mad black scientist by the name of Yaqub set up the machinery for grafting whites out of blacks through the operation of a birth control system. The population on this island of Patmos was 59,999, and whenever a couple on this island wanted to get married, they were only allowed to do so if there was a difference in their color, so that by mating black with those in the population of a brownish color, and brown with brown, but never black with black, all traces of the black were eventually eliminated. The process was repeated until all the brown was eliminated, leaving only men of the red race. The red was bleached out, leaving only yellow. Then the yellow was bleached out, and only white was left. Thus Yaqub, who was long since dead, because this whole process took hundreds of years, had finally succeeded in creating the white devil with the blue eyes of death. This myth of the creation of the white race, called Yaqub's history, is an inversion of the racial death wish of American Negroes. Yaqub's plan is still being followed by many Negroes today. Quite simply, many Negroes believe, as the principle of assimilation into white America implies, that the race problem in America cannot be settled until all traces of the black race are eliminated. Toward this end, many Negroes loathe the very idea of two very dark Negroes mating. The children, they say, will come out ugly. What they mean is that the children are sure to be black, and this is not desirable. From the widespread use of cosmetics to bleach the black out of one's skin, and other concoctions to take Africa out of one's hair, to the extreme resorted to by more Negroes than one might wish to believe of undergoing nose thinning and lip clipping operations. The racial death wish of American Negroes, Yaqub's goal, takes its terrible toll. What has been happening for the past 400 years is that the white man, through his access to black women, has been pumping his blood and genes into the blacks, has been diluting the blood and genes of the blacks, i.e., has been fulfilling Yaqub's plan and accelerating the Negro's racial death wish. The case of James Baldwin aside for a moment, it seems that many Negro homosexuals acquiescing in this racial death wish are outraged and frustrated because in their sickness they are unable to have a baby by a white man. The cross they have to bear is that, already bending over and touching their toes for the white man, the fruit of their miscegenation is not the little half-white offspring of their dreams, but an increase in the unwinding of their nerves, though they redouble their efforts and intake of the white man's sperm. In this land of dichotomies and disunited opposites, those truly concerned with the resurrection of black Americans have had eternally to deal with black intellectuals who have become their own opposites, taking on all of the behavior patterns of their enemy, vices and virtues, in an effort to aspire to alien standards in all respects. The gulf between an audacious, bootlicking Uncle Tom and an intellectual buck dancer is filled only with sophistication and style. On second thought, Uncle Tom comes off much cleaner here because usually he is just trying to survive, choosing to pretend to be something other than his true self in order to please the white man and thus receive favors. Whereas the intellectual sycophant does not pretend to be other than he actually is, but hates what he is, and seeks to redefine himself in the image of his white idols. He becomes a white man in a black body, a self-willed, automated slave. He becomes the white man's most valuable tool in oppressing other blacks. The black homosexual, when his twist has a racial nexus, is an extreme embodiment of this contradiction. The white man has deprived him of his masculinity, castrated him in the center of his burning skull, and when he submits to this change and takes the white man for his lover, as well as Big Daddy, he focuses on whiteness, all the love in his pent-up soul, and turns the razor edge of hatred against blackness upon himself, what he is, and all those who look like him, remind him of himself. He may even hate the darkness of night. The racial death wish is manifested as the driving force in James Baldwin. His hatred for blacks, even as he pleads what he conceives as their cause, makes him the apotheosis of the dilemma in the ethos of the black bourgeoisie who have completely rejected their African heritage, consider the loss irrevocable, and refuse to look again in that direction. This is the root of Baldwin's violent repudiation of Mailer's The White Negro. To understand what is at stake here, and to understand it in terms of the life of this nation, is to know the central fact that the relationship between black and white in America is a power equation, a power struggle, and that this power struggle is not only manifested in the aggregate, civil rights, black nationalism, etc., but also in the interpersonal relationships, actions, and reactions between blacks and whites were taken into account. When those two lean cats, Baldwin and Mailer, met in a French living room, it was precisely this power equation that was at work. It is fascinating to read, and nobody knows my name, in what terms this power equation was manifested in Baldwin's immediate reaction to that meeting. Quote, "And here we were, suddenly circling around each other. We liked each other at once, but each was frightened that the other would pull rank. He could have pulled rank on me because he was more famous and had more money, and also because he was white. But I could have pulled rank on him precisely because I was black and knew more about the periphery he so helplessly maligns in The White Negro." than he could ever hope to know. End quote. Pulling rank, it would seem, is a very dangerous business, especially when the troops have mutinied and the basis of one's authority or rank is devoid of that interdictive power and has become suspect. One would think that for Baldwin, of all people, these hues of black and white were no longer armed with the power to intimidate. And if one thought this, one would be exceedingly wrong. For behind the structure of the thought of Baldwin's quoted above, there lurks the imp of Baldwin's unwinding of his tension between love and hate, love of the white and hate of the black. And when we dig into this tension, we will find that when those two lean cats crossed tracks in that French living room, one was a pussycat, the other a tiger. Baldwin's purr was transmitted magnificently in The Fire Next Time, but his work is the fruit of a tree with a poison root. Such succulent fruit, such a painful tree, what a malignant root. It is ironic but fascinating for what it reveals about the ferment in the North American soul in our time, that Norman Mailer, the white boy, and James Baldwin, the black boy, encountered each other in the eye of a social storm, traveling in opposite directions. The white boy, with knowledge of white Negroes, was traveling toward a confrontation with the black, with Africa, while the black boy, with a white mind, was on his way to Europe. Baldwin's nose, like the north-seeking needle on a compass, is forever pointed toward his adopted fatherland, Europe. His by intellectual osmosis, and in Africa's stead. What he says of Aimé Césaire, one of the greatest black writers of the 20th century, and intending it as an ironic rebuke, that, quote, he had penetrated into the heart of the great wilderness which was Europe and stolen the sacred fire, which was the assurance of his power, end quote, seems only too clearly to speak more about Peter than it does about Paul. What Baldwin seems to forget is that Césaire explains that fire, whether sacred or profane, burns. In Baldwin's case, though the fire could not burn the black off his face, it certainly did burn it out of his heart. I'm not interested in denying anything to Baldwin. I, like the entire nation, owe a great debt to him. But throughout the range of his work, from Go Tell It on the Mountain, through Notes of a Native Son, Nobody Knows My Name, Another Country, to The Fire Next Time, all of which I treasure, there is a decisive quirk in Baldwin's vision which corresponds to his relationship to black people and to masculinity. It was this same quirk, in my opinion, that compelled Baldwin to slander Rufus Scott in Another Country, venerate Andre Gide, repudiate the white Negro, and drive the blade of Brutus into the corpse of Richard Wright. As Baldwin has said in Nobody Knows My Name, quote, I think that I know something about the American masculinity which most men of my generation do not know because they have not been menaced by it in the way I have been, end quote. Okay, sugar, but isn't it true that Rufus Scott, the weak, craven-hearted ghost of Another Country, bears the same relation to Bigger Thomas of native son, the black rebel of the ghetto, and a man, as you yourself bore to the fallen giant, Richard Wright, a rebel and a man? Somewhere in one of his books, Richard Wright describes an encounter between a ghost and several young Negroes. The young Negroes rejected the homosexual, and this was Wright alluding to a classic, if cruel, example of a ubiquitous phenomenon in the black ghettos of America. The practice by Negro youths of going punk hunting. This practice of seeking out homosexuals on the prowl, rolling them, beating them up, seemingly just to satisfy some savage impulse to inflict pain on the specific target selected. The social outcast seems to me to be not unrelated in terms of the psychological mechanisms involved to the ritualistic lynchings and castrations inflicted on Southern blacks by Southern whites. This was, as I recall, one of Wright's few comments on the subject of homosexuality. I think it can be safely said that the man in Wright's books, albeit shackled with a form of impotence, was strongly heterosexual. Their heterosexuality was implied rather than laboriously stated or emphasized. It was taken for granted, as we all take men until something occurs to make us know otherwise. And Bigger Thomas, Wright's greatest creation, was a man in violent, though inept rebellion against the stifling, murderous, totalitarian white world. There was no trace in Bigger of a Martin Luther King type self-effacing love for his oppressors. For example, Bigger would have been completely baffled, as most Negroes are today, at Baldwin's advice to his nephew, the fire next time, concerning white people. Quote, "You must accept them and accept them with love, for these innocent people have no other hope." End quote. Rufus Scott, a pathetic wretch who indulged in the white man's pastime of committing suicide, who let a white bisexual homosexual fuck him in the ass, and who took a Southern Jezebel for his woman, with all that these tortured relationships imply, was the epitome of a black eunuch who has completely submitted to the white man. Yes, Rufus was a psychological freedom rider, turning the ultimate cheek, murmuring like a ghost, quote, "You took the best, so why not take the rest?" End quote. Which has absolutely nothing to do with the way Negroes have managed to survive here in the hells of North America. This all becomes very clear from what we learn of Eric, the arch-ghost of another country, of the depths of his alienation from his body and the source of his need. Quote, "And it had taken him almost until this very moment, on the eve of his departure, to begin to recognize that part of Rufus' great power over him had to do with the past, which Eric had buried in some deep, dark place, was connected with himself in Alabama, when I wasn't nothing but a child, with the cold white people and the warm black people, warm at least for him." End quote. So too, who cannot wonder at the source of such audacious madness as moved Baldwin to make this startling remark about Richard Wright in his ignoble essay, "Alas, Poor Richard"? quote, "In my own relations with him, I was always exasperated by his notions of society, politics, and history, for they seemed to me utterly fanciful. I never believed that he had any real sense of how a society is put together." End quote. Richard Wright is dead, and Baldwin is alive and with us. Baldwin says that Richard Wright held notions that were utterly fanciful, and Baldwin is an honorable man. O judgment, thou art fled to brutish beasts, and men have lost their reason. Wright has no need, as Caesar did, of an outraged Antony to plead his cause. His life and his work are his shield against the mellow thrust of Brutus's blade. The good that he did, unlike Caesar's, will not be interred with his bones. It is, on the contrary, only the living who can be harmed by Brutus. Baldwin says that in Wright's writings, violence sits enthroned where sex should be. If this is so, then it is only because in the North American reality, hate holds sway in love's true province. And it is only through a rank perversion that the artist, whose duty is to tell us the truth, can turn the $2 trick of wedding violence to love and sex to hate, if, to achieve this end, one has basely to transmute rebellion into lamb-like submission. "You took the best," sniveled Rufus, "so why not take the rest?" Richard Wright was not ghost enough to achieve this cruel distortion. With him, sex, being not a spectator sport or a panacea, but the sacred vehicle of life and love, is itself sacred. And the America which Wright knew and which is not the Garden of Eden, but its opposite. Baldwin, embodying in his art the self-flagellating policy of Martin Luther King, and giving out falsely the news that the day of the ghost has arrived, pulled it off in another country. Of all black American novelists, and indeed of all American novelists of any hue, Richard Wright reigned supreme for his profound political, economic, and social reference. Wright had the ability, like Dreiser, of harnessing the gigantic, overwhelming environmental forces and focusing them with pinpoint sharpness on individuals and their acts as they are caught up in the whirlwind of the savage, anarchistic sweep of life, love, death, and hate, pain, hope, pleasure, and despair across the face of a nation and the world. But O masters, it is Baldwin's work which is so void of a political, economic, or even a social reference. His characters all seem to be fucking and sucking in a vacuum. Baldwin has a superb touch when he speaks of human beings, when he is inside of them, especially his homosexuals, but he flounders when he looks beyond the skin, whereas Wright's forte, it seems to me, was in reflecting the intricate mechanisms of a social organizations, its functioning as a unit. Baldwin's essay on Richard Wright reveals that he despised not Richard Wright, but his masculinity. He cannot confront the stud in others, except that he must either submit to it or destroy it. And he was not about to bow to a black man. Wright understood and lived the truth of what Norman Mailer meant when he said, quote, "For being a man is the continuing battle of one's life, and one loses a bit of manhood with every stale compromise to the authority of any power in which one does not believe." Baldwin compromised beyond getting back by the white man's power, which is real and which has nothing to do with authority, but to which Baldwin has ultimately succumbed psychologically, is totally unable to extricate himself from that horrible plane. It is the scourge of his art, because the only way out for him is psychologically to embrace Africa, the land of his fathers, which he utterly refuses to do. He has instead resorted to a despicable underground guerrilla war waged on paper against black masculinity, playing out the racial death wish of Yakub, reaching, I think, a point where Miller hits the spot. Quote, "Driven into defiance, it is natural, if regrettable, that many homosexuals go to the direction of assuming that there is something intrinsically superior in homosexuality, and carried far enough, it is a viewpoint which is as stultifying, as ridiculous, and as anti-human as the heterosexual's prejudice." End quote. I, for one, do not think homosexuality is the latest advance over heterosexuality on the scale of human evolution. Homosexuality is a sickness, just as are baby rape or wanting to become the head of General Motors. A grave danger faces this nation, of which we are as yet unaware, and it is precisely this danger which Baldwin's work conceals, indeed, leads us away from. We are engaged in the deepest, the most fundamental revolution and reconstruction which men have ever been called upon to make in their lives, in which they absolutely cannot escape or avoid except at the peril of the very continued existence of human life on this planet. The time of the sham is over, and the cheek of the suffering saint must no longer be turned twice to the brute. The titillation of the guilt complexes of bored white liberals leads to doom. The grotesque hideousness of what is happening to us is reflected in this remark by Murray Kempton, quoted in The Realist. "When I was a boy, Stepin Fetchit was the only Negro actor who worked regularly in the movies. The fashion changes, but I sometimes think that Malcolm X, and to a degree even James Baldwin, are our Stepin Fetchits." Yes, the fashion does change. "Will the machine gunners please step forward?" said Leroy Jones in a poem. "The machine gun on the corner," wrote Richard Wright, "is the symbol of the 20th century. The embryonic spirit of kamikaze, real and alive, grows each day in the black man's heart, and there are dreams of Nat Turner's legacy. The ghost of John Brown is creeping through suburbia, and I wonder if James Chaney said, as Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner stood helplessly watching, as the grisly dogs crushed his bones with savage blows of chains. Did poor James say after Rufus Scott, 'You took the best, so why not take the rest?' Or did he turn to his white brothers, seeing their plight, and say after Baldwin, "That's your problem, baby"? I say after Miller, "There's a shitstorm coming." Rallying round the flag, I distinguished between two colonialisms, between a domestic one and an external one. Capitalism at home is domestic colonialism. Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah. Consciousism. 5 years ago, even the most audacious visionary would not have dared predict the slashing do-or-die desperation and the sizzling up-tempo beat which has exploded into our politics, into our daily conversation, and into our nightmares and dreams. The ferment beneath the surface of our formal politics and public debate has grown more important in the last 5 years than at any time since the years preceding the Civil War. The parapolitics of the first Johnson Congress, which in contrast to most of its predecessors seemed to resemble the dynamiting of a logjam, was actually sluggish, compromising, and drag-footish in terms of the pressing social problems which are feeding the conflagration raging in America's soul. Problems which can no longer be compromised or swept cleverly under that national rug of self-delusion. The possibility of concealment no longer exists, and the only ones deceived are the deceivers themselves. Those who are victimized by these social problems, Negroes, the aged, unemployed, and unemployable, the poor, the miseducated and dissatisfied students, the haters of war and lovers of man, have flung back the rug in outraged rebellion, refusing to be silenced until their grievances are uncompromisingly redressed. America has come alive deep down in its raw guts, and vast contending forces of revolutionary momentum are squaring off in this land for decisive showdowns from which no one can purchase sanctuary. Americans are becoming increasingly polarized right and left, with the great body of the people in the middle confused, and sometimes, to mark their confusion, feigning indifference. Extremism of the right, extremism of the left. Not since the 30s and the cringing McCarthy era have these slogans been armed with the power to kill. On the lips of articulate people today, right and left are verbal razor blades in a sense unparalleled in American history. California's former Governor Brown issued the ominous warning that the stench of fascism is in the air. The last Republican presidential candidate was branded a right-wing extremist, and the FBI's J. Edgar Hoover, America's flattest foot, periodically issues grave reminders that left-wingers, having mastered deceit, are almost succeeding in subverting this, and are busily boring from within to take over that. Both right and left claim to love their country. The Ku Klux Klan, John Birch Society, American Nazi Party, conservative Republicans, Minutemen, even the Hells Angels, all wrap themselves up in the American flag and solemnly call themselves patriots. Their enemies and critics, seeing that the right wing would not disappear when spoofed as kooks, nuts, and little old ladies in tennis shoes, surprised and frightened by their potential strength as indicated by 26 million votes cast for Goldwater, now grant them de facto political status by applying to them such sophisticated labels as neo-fascist and right-winger. As for the left, all red-blooded Americans who love TV and gentle toilet tissue know that the Negro Revolution was conceived in Moscow. Scratch Moscow, insert Peking, and launched by left-wing fanatics, and that the growing mass movement in opposition to America's war in Vietnam is, quote, communist-inspired, manipulated, and controlled, end quote. It is not an overstatement to say that the destiny of the entire human race depends on the outcome of what is going on in America today. This is a staggering reality to the rest of the world. They must feel like passengers in a supersonic jetliner who are forced to watch helplessly while a passel of drunks, hypes, freaks, and madmen fight for the controls and the pilot seat. Whether America decisively moves to the right or to the left is the fundamental political problem in the world today. And the most serious question now before the American people is who now, in this post-civil rights era, are the true patriots, the new right or the new left? The question of the Negro's place in America, which for a long time could actually be kicked around as a serious question, has been decisively resolved. He is here to stay. But the Negro Revolution is the real bedrock of the battleground on which the new right and the new left are contending. In a sense, both the new left and the new right are the spawn of the Negro Revolution. A broad national consensus was developed over the civil rights struggle, and it had the sophistication and morality to repudiate the right wing. The consensus, which stands between a violent nation and chaos, is America's most precious possession. But there are those who despise it. The task which the new right has feverishly undertaken is to erode and break up this consensus, something that is a distinct possibility since the precise issues and conditions which gave birth to the consensus no longer exist. On the other hand, the task of the new left has been to hold the consensus together during the period of transition from the civil rights struggle to the post-civil rights era, which may see the growth of a broader movement challenging the structure of political and economic power in America. The fact that Johnson adopted Goldwater's foreign policy has severely disillusioned a significant sector of the consensus. Many felt it was a betrayal of trust. This nation had just begun to relax after fighting a battle for its moral life, a battle which gave birth to a trust that became a holy cause, and the betrayal of this trust, this cause, may one day be looked upon as having laid the foundation of cynicism and political depravity that prepared the way for America's Hitler. Nevertheless, in seeking to hold the consensus together, the left is aided tremendously by the enemies it makes, and more so by the enemies it inherited from the civil rights struggle. The lewd spectacle of Dixiecratic dinosaurs denouncing the Protestants of the war in Vietnam can only infuriate and educate large sectors of the public who lost their bearings during the period of transition. All the new left need to do is point. Look, there's old Scurvy X, and dig who's with him, that filthy Y. Remember what they said about Selma? At the same time, the link between America's undercover support of colonialism abroad and the bondage of the Negro at home becomes increasingly clearer. Those who are primarily concerned with improving the Negro's condition recognize, as do proponents of the liquidation of America's neo-colonial network, that their fight is one and the same. They see the key contradiction of our time. We conceal something of the truth by saying that the New Left merely opposes America's foreign policy. That is a euphemism for their support of national liberation in those areas of the world still under de jure colonial rule and those under the thumb of neo-colonial puppet regimes. The United States has the yes or no power of decision over all colonialism in the world today. There is not a colonial regime on the face of the earth today that could survive 6 months if the U.S. opposed it, and in many cases, without the active military and economic support of the U.S., the exploiting, murderous regimes would be dashed to bits by the exploited people themselves. The New Left understands this thoroughly. It also knows that America's support of colonialism must be shattered before the resources and administrative machinery of the nation can be freed for the task of creating a truly free and humanistic society here at home. It is at this point, at the juncture of foreign policy and domestic policy, that the Negro Revolution becomes one with the World Revolution. Those who most bitterly oppose Negro progress are also the most ardent advocates of a belligerent foreign policy, the most violent castigators of critics of American escalation of war against the Vietnamese people, the hardest to die of the die-hard enthusiasts of armed intervention in the internal affairs of the Dominican Republic and Latin America generally. It is no coincidence that such political cavemen and fossilized intellects as Senator Stennis of Mississippi and Strom Thurmond of South Carolina were the first to speak out against the Vietnam Day demonstrations and protest marches held throughout America in October 1965. They who once spoke out so vehemently against the Negro Revolution are still fighting the same war. They have merely retreated to different terrain. The massive upsurge of the Negro people and the support and sympathy aroused in the white community beat the dinosaurs back from their first line of defense, the color line. But these opponents of the Negro Revolution, routed on the issue of civil rights, have by no means folded up their tents and slinked away disgracefully in defeat. They have regrouped and entrenched themselves on a new front. They understand that the Negro's basic situation cannot really change without structural changes in America's political and economic system. What the Negro now needs and consciously seeks is political and economic power. And ultimately we shall witness the merging of the Negro Revolution with a broader movement demanding disarmament and conversion of the economy to peaceful purposes. This prospect of an alliance between the Negro Revolution, the New Left, and the peace movement fills the power structure with apprehension. Witness the furious reaction provoked by Martin Luther King when he called for the cessation of American bombings of North Vietnam, negotiations with the National Liberation Front, and admission of China into the UN. The fight against the Negro Revolution, as long as this was possible, was waged in the name of the flag and the Constitution. Now, in this new stage of the struggle, the opposition is again employing as weapons the very same tools with which they had once been defeated. They are the only weapons remaining to the right-wing forces, short of naked terror and military repression, to which they would eagerly resort if they saw no other way. Curiously, on this new level of struggle, they have much brighter hopes of success. The issues are more clouded. The moral issue has not yet become clear-cut as it was in the civil rights struggle, and the right is able to manipulate the people by playing upon the have gun will travel streak in America's character, coupled with the narcissistic self-image as a friend of the underdog. Americans think of themselves collectively as a huge rescue squad on 24-hour call to any spot on the globe where dispute and conflict may erupt. It does not make sense to the American people to fight a war half-heartedly. Goldwater knew this when he campaigned for president, and the right knows it today. If America is at war in Vietnam, then it makes sense to Americans when the right wing indignantly demands the application of more and more force, increased bombings, gas, napalm, and even nuclear weapons, the use of any and all effective weapons to kill and defeat the enemy and get it over with. Americans like to get a job done, and what they hate most of all is to drag out a job when they have the means in their hands of completing it. The Johnson administration feels obligated to obfuscate the issue by refusing to clarify to the American people the true nature of the Vietnam conflict. By interpreting the Vietnam situation as a war between two sovereign nations, the communist North, having invaded the peace-loving democratic South, LBJ is able to pose as a courageous do-gooder coming to the aid of a weak underdog, while a cynical world, as usual, looks on and refuses to help Uncle Sam do his good deed. The power structure cannot publicly recognize that the Vietnamese conflict is a civil war, because such an acknowledgement would reveal us as an aggressor intervening on a favored side in a civil conflict. In fact, America's intervention has transformed a civil war into a war of national liberation. The president cannot afford to tell the truth to the American people because he knows they would not support the war if they really understood. It is only by keeping them confused and hysterical. The job of the vast, centralized, collusive mass media that LBJ is able to get away with it. And this is the source of Johnson's great fear of the teachings and protest demonstrations. The truth is electric, and it spreads. What galls Johnson and the new right is the fear that the mounting protest against their policy will awaken the American people. They know that masses of Americans would come out to demonstrate against LBJ. Mass embarrassment at such obviously hypocritical actions as the American intervention in the Dominican Republic on the bloody side of a right-wing military junta might turn to mass anger. The world capitalist system has come to a decisive fork in the road, and this is at the heart of our national crisis. The road to the left is the way of reconciliation with the exploited people of the world, the liberation of all peoples, the dismantling of all economic relations based upon the exploitation of man by man, universal disarmament, and the establishment of international rule of law with effective means of enforcement. The road to the right is refusal to submit to the universal demand for national liberation, economic justice, peace, and popular sovereignty. To walk this last path, the decision makers must be prepared to unleash worldwide genocide, including the extermination of America's Negroes. The people within these countries who try to stand against the will of the overwhelming majority of the human race must be willing to forego the last traces of their own liberty and see their governments turned into totalitarian regimes tolerating no dissent. The rage of the American power structure over the exercise of the constitutional right to dissent, to assemble and peacefully petition against Johnson's war in Vietnam is only a mild taste of the hemlock the people will be forced to swallow if they allow their country to go down the death-seeking branch of the fork. President Kennedy gave the distinct impression of commitment to the path of reconciliation, and it was the source of much of his appeal. What frightens people about President Johnson is that he seems to be trying to walk down both roads simultaneously, but he cannot play his double game for long. Sooner or later, he and his successors will have to choose. The new right and the new left in America, each trying to lead the nation down the diverging branches of the fork, have between them the fate of the world and the hopes of a tortured, bleeding humanity, forever seeking life and almost always receiving betrayal and death from the outstretched hand of the seducer. The black man's stake in Vietnam. The most critical tests facing Johnson are the war in Vietnam and the Negro Revolution at home. The fact that the brains in the Pentagon see fit to send 16% black troops to Vietnam is one indication that there is a structural relationship between these two arenas of conflict. And the initial outrageous refusal of the Georgia legislature to seat Representative-elect Julian Bond because he denounced the aggressive U.S. role in Vietnam shows too the very intimate relationship between the way human beings are being treated in Vietnam and the treatment they are receiving here in the United States. We live today in a system that is in the last stages of the protracted process of breaking up on a worldwide basis. The rulers of this system have their hands full. Injustice is being challenged at every turn and on every level. The rulers perceive the greatest threat to be the national liberation movements around the world, particularly in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. In order for them to wage wars of suppression against these national liberation movements abroad, they must have peace and stability and unanimity of purpose at home. But at home there is a Trojan horse, a black Trojan horse, that has become aware of itself and is now struggling to get on its feet. It too demands liberation. What is the purpose of the attention that the rulers are now focusing on the Trojan horse? Is it out of a new found love for the horse? Or is it because the rulers need the horse to be quiet, to be still, and not cause the rulers already with their backs pressed to the wall any trouble or embarrassment while they forced the war in Vietnam. Indeed, the rulers have need of the horse's power on the fields of battle. What the black man in America must keep constantly in mind is that the doctrine of white supremacy, which is a part of the ideology of the world system the power structure is trying to preserve, lets the black man in for the greatest portion of the suffering and hate which white supremacy has dished out to the non-white people of the world for hundreds of years. The white supremacy oriented white man feels less compunction about massacring niggers than he does about massacring any other race of people on earth. This historically indisputable fact, taken with the present persistent efforts of the United States to woo the Soviet Union into an alliance against China, spells danger to all the peoples of the world who have been victims of white supremacy. If this sweethearting proves successful, if the United States is finally able to make a match with Russia, or if the U.S. can continue to frighten the Soviet Union into reneging on its commitments to international socialist solidarity, about which the Soviets are always trumpeting, while still allowing the imperialist aggressors to daily bomb the Democratic Republic of North Vietnam, and if the U.S. is able to unleash its anxious fury in armed might against the rising non-white giant of China, which is the real target of U.S. policy in Vietnam and the object evil of U.S. strategy the world over, if the U.S. is successful in these areas, then it will be the black man's turn again to face the lyncher and burner of the world, and face him alone. Black Americans are too easily deceived by a few smiles and friendly gestures, by the passing of a few liberal-sounding laws which are left on the books to rot unenforced, and by the mushy speech-making of a president who is a past master of talking out of the thousand sides of his mouth. Such poetry does not guarantee the safe future of the black people in America. The black people must have a guarantee. They must be certain. They must be sure beyond all doubt that the reign of terror is ended and not just suspended, and that the future of their people is secure. And the only way they can ensure this is to gain organizational unity and communication with their brothers and allies around the world. On an international basis, they must have this power. There is no other way. Anything else is a sellout of the future of their people. The world of today was fashioned yesterday. What is involved here, what is being decided right now, is the shape of power in the world tomorrow. The American racial problem can no longer be spoken of or solved in isolation. The relationship between the genocide in Vietnam and the smiles of the white man toward black Americans is a direct relationship. Once the white man solves his problem in the East, he will then turn his fury again on the black people of America, his long-time punching bag. The black people have been tricked again and again, sold out at every turn by misleaders. After the Civil War, America went through a period similar to the one we are now in. The Negro problem received a full hearing. Everybody knew that the black man had been denied justice. No one doubted that it was time for changes and that the black man should be made a first-class citizen. But Reconstruction ended. Blacks who had been elevated to high positions were brusquely kicked out into the streets and herded along with the masses of blacks into the ghettos and black belts. The lyncher and the burner received virtual license to murder blacks at will. White Americans found a new level on which to cool the blacks out. And with the help of such tools as Booker T. Washington, the doctrine of segregation was clamped firmly onto the backs of blacks. It has taken 100 years to struggle up from that level of cool out to the miserable position that black Americans now find themselves in. Time is passing. The historical opportunity which world events now present to black Americans is running out with every tick of the clock. This is the last act of the show. We are living in a time when the people of the world are making their final bid for full and complete freedom. Never before in history has this condition prevailed. Always before there have been more or less articulate and aware pockets of people, portions of classes, etc. But today's is an era of mass awareness, when the smallest man on the street is in rebellion against a system which has denied him life and which he has come to understand robs him of his dignity and self-respect. Yet, he is being told that it will take time to get programs started, to pass legislation, to educate white people into accepting the idea that black people want and deserve freedom. But it is physically impossible to move as fast as the black man would like to move. Black men are deadly serious when they say freedom now. Even if the white man wanted to eradicate all traces of evil overnight, he would not be able to do it because the economic and political system will not permit it. All talk about going too fast is treasonous to the black man's future. What the white man must be brought to understand is that the black man in America today is fully aware of his position, and he does not intend to be tricked again into another 100-year forfeit of freedom. Not for a single moment or for any price will the black men now rising up in America settle for anything less than their full proportionate share and participation in the sovereignty of America. The black man has already come to a realization that to be free it is necessary for him to throw his life, everything, on the line, because the oppressors refuse to understand that it is now impossible for them to come up with another trick to squelch the black revolution. The black man can't afford to take a chance. He can't afford to put things off. He must stop the whole show now and get his business straight, because if he does not do it now, if he fails to grasp securely the reins of this historic opportunity, there may be no tomorrow for him. The black man's interest lies in seeing a free and independent Vietnam, a strong Vietnam which is not the puppet of international white supremacy. If the nations of Asia, Latin America, and Africa are strong and free, the black man in America will be safe and secure and free to live in dignity and self-respect. It is a cold fact that while the nations of Africa, Asia, and Latin America were shackled in colonial bondage, the black American was held tightly in the vice of oppression and not permitted to utter a sound of protest of any effect. But when these nations started bidding for their freedom, It was then that black Americans were able to seize the chance. It was then that the white man yielded what little he did out of sheer necessity. The only lasting salvation for the black American is to do all he can to see to it that the African, Asian, and Latin American nations are free and independent. In this regard, black Americans have a big role to play. They are a black Trojan horse within white America, and they number in excess of 23 million strong. That is a lot of strength, but it is a lot of weakness if it is disorganized and at odds with itself. Right now, it is deplorably disorganized, and the overriding need is for unity and organization. Unity is on all black lips. Today we stand on the verge of sweeping change in this wretched landscape of 1,000 little fragmented and ineffectual groups and organizations unable to work together for the common cause. The need for one organization that will give one voice to the black man's common interests is felt in every bone and fiber of black America. Yesterday, after firmly repudiating racism and breaking his ties with the black Muslim organization, the late Malcolm X launched a campaign to transform the American black man's struggle from the narrow plea for civil rights to the universal demand for human rights, with the ultimate aim of bringing the United States government to task before the United Nations. This and the idea of the Organization of Afro-American Unity was Malcolm's dying legacy to his people. It did not fall on barren ground. Already, black American leaders have met with the ambassadors of black Africa at a luncheon at UN headquarters. The meaning of this momentous event is lost on no one. The fact that it was the issue of Julian Bond, his denunciation of U.S. aggression in Vietnam, and the action of racist elements in the Georgia legislature, which brought the leaders of black Africa and black America together, is prophetic of an even clearer recognition by black men that their interests are also threatened by the U.S. war of suppression in Vietnam. This dovetailing of causes and issues is designed to bring to fruition the other dream which Malcolm's assassination prevented him from realizing: the Organization of Afro-American Unity, or perhaps a similar organization under a different name. Black Americans now realize that they must organize for the power to change the foreign and domestic policies of the U.S. government. They must let their voice be heard on these issues. They must let the world know where they stand. It is no accident that the U.S. government is sending all those black troops to Vietnam. Some people think that America's point in sending 16% black troops to Vietnam is to kill off the cream of black youth. But it has another important result. By turning her black troops into butchers of the Vietnamese people, America is spreading hate against the black race throughout Asia. Even black Africans find it hard not to hate black Americans for being so stupid as to allow themselves to be used to slaughter another people who are fighting to be free. Black Americans are considered to be the world's biggest fools to go to another country to fight for something they don't have for themselves. It bothers white racists that people around the world love black Americans but find it impossible to give a similar warm affection to white Americans. The white racist knows that he is the ugly American, and he wants the black American to be ugly too in the eyes of the world. Misery loves company. When the people around the world cry, "Yankee, go home," they mean the white man, not the black man who is a recently freed slave. The white man is deliberately trying to make the people of the world turn against black Americans, because he knows that the day is coming when black Americans will need the help and support of their brothers, friends, and natural allies around the world. If through stupidity or by following hand-picked leaders who are the servile agents of the power structure, black Americans allow this strategy to succeed against them, then when the time comes and they need this help and support from around the world, it will not be there. All of the international love, respect, and goodwill that black Americans now have around the world will have dried up. They themselves will have buried it in the mud of the rice paddies of Vietnam.